I want to tell you about a Wednesday morning in October of 1852. At Havelock Mill on the edge of the West Riding of Yorkshire, at the exact moment a lord of some consequence made the sort of mistake a man can spend a lifetime being grateful for, though it would cost him 2 days of considerable embarrassment and one very long night of honest reckoning before he understood that. His name was Julian Aldridge, Viscount Aldridge, and he had come north to negotiate a contract. He arrived at the mill gate in a hired carriage. His own was being re-wheeled, one more small indignity in a long season of them, and was let inside by a young clerk named Perkins, who had instructions to show his lordship to the foreman's office and offer him refreshment while the proprietress was fetched. The mill was already at full noise. The rhythmic clatter of power looms going at pace, the smell of wool and machine oil, the deep, constant hum of a building that knew its purpose well. Lord Aldridge followed Perkins down the central aisle of the weaving floor, past rows of looms, and the workers bent over them, and at the far end of the room, at the last loom in the row, a woman was crouched with her sleeves pushed up past her elbows, one hand in the mechanism, explaining something to the mill's mechanic in a voice too low to carry over the din. She had on a plain dark dress and a leather apron worn soft with use, and there was a stripe of machine oil across the back of her left wrist, and she was pointing at something inside the loom with the focused authority of someone who has explained this particular problem before, and fully expects it will need explaining again. Perkins paused near the foreman's station, and Lord Aldridge paused beside him. The woman at the loom glanced up, registered a visitor, and straightened. Now, I want you to hold that image, because the whole of what I am about to tell you lives in what happened next, and it was over in 30 seconds, and Lord Aldridge would spend the better part of 2 days not knowing he had done it. He reached into his breast pocket. He produced a card, his own stiff creamstock, Viscount Aldridge engraved. He held it toward the woman in the leather apron as Perkins stepped forward to introduce the arriving foreman, a steady man named Brackett. "Perhaps," said Lord Aldridge pleasantly, not unkindly, "I want to be fair to him. You might give this to Mrs. Trent if you see her before I do. Tell her Viscount Aldridge has arrived. She is expecting me." The woman in the leather apron looked at the card. She looked at him, and something shifted very slightly at the corner of her mouth, something he was too preoccupied to notice, and she took the card from his hand and closed her fingers around it and said, quite composedly, "Of course, my lord." Lord Aldridge thanked her and followed young Perkins toward the office at the back of the mill, entirely satisfied with the small business of his arrival. "And I am going to stop there. I am going to hold him in that corridor." Lord Aldridge, 36 years old, Viscount of a moderately encumbered estate in Derbyshire, walking toward a business meeting he has spent 3 weeks dreading, and I am going to make quite certain you understand what he has just done. He has handed his card to the proprietress of Havelock Mill. He has just asked the woman who owns the looms, who hired every worker in that room, who holds every contract and account and correspondence in her head and on her desk, who has been running this mill for 3 years and running it well. He has asked her to carry a message. He did it politely. He did it without malice. He did it in the effortless, unthinking way of a man who looked at a woman in a leather apron in a weaving room and saw, without meaning to, only what he had arrived expecting to see. She is standing at the far end of the floor with his card in her hand, and she is deciding, right now, exactly what to do with it. Sit with that a moment. Let it settle, because I am going to tell you everything that comes of it. But first, and you know by now that I have my particular way of doing things, I would ask you before we go further to find the subscribe button for Moonlight at Bellwood and press it. It asks nothing of you. Half a breath, that is all. And it means the next story finds you the moment I have it ready. There is always a next story. There is always a fire to sit beside. I would hate for you to miss a single one. Now come back with me, down that weaving room, to the woman in the leather apron, And let me tell you exactly who she was. Her name was Miriam Trent. She was 29 years old. She had been the proprietress of Havelock Mill for 3 years and 4 months, since the death of her husband, Robert Trent, who had built the mill from a single room with 3 looms and a great deal of stubbornness, and who had left it to her without condition or hesitation because, as he had said, and I believe him entirely, she understood it better than anyone he had ever employed. She had grown up at her father's side in a smaller mill in the next valley. She had learned the looms before she learned French. She could read a warp tension problem from across a room and calculate a supply shortfall in her head before most men found a pencil. When Robert died, there had been people, well-meaning, mostly, who suggested she appoint a manager, that it was a great deal for a woman alone, that there were good men who could take the practical concerns off her hands. Miriam had thanked them individually, and then appointed the best foreman she could find, a man who understood that his job was the looms and hers was everything else, and she had got on with it. She had discovered 2 things in those 3 years. The first was that she was very good at this, better than she had known she would be, which was saying something, because she had never doubted herself particularly. She knew the numbers, and she knew the workers, and she knew which suppliers could be trusted and which quoted low and delivered late. She walked the floor every morning before the looms started, not because she had to, but because it grounded her. The smell of the place, the cold of the early hour, the feel of the machines under her hands. It was hers, and she was glad of it every single day. The second thing was harder. It was this: the moment a man arrived at Havelock Mill and saw a woman behind the desk, something happened behind his eyes, some slight rearrangement, and from that moment, without intending to, or sometimes very much intending to, he would begin to look for the real decision-maker, the foreman, the solicitor, the ghost of the late Mr. Trent. They would address their questions to the air, slightly above her left shoulder. They would nod at what she said, and then repeat it to Brackett, as though it required a man's confirmation to become true. She had learned to manage it. She had perfected a manner, brisk, precise, a little cool, that cut through most of it. But it cost her something every time. There had been 2 contracts in the past year, renegotiated, at worse terms than she had agreed to, because the other party had gone round her to her solicitor and implied a misunderstanding, and Miriam had spent considerable energy on battles that should never have begun. So when Lord Aldridge's letter arrived 3 weeks prior, formal and correct, requesting the favour of an interview to discuss a long-term supply agreement, she had felt the familiar weight settle over her. Another one, another man who had read M. Trent, proprietress, and decided, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that the situation was manageable, that there would be a way in. She had nearly put him off entirely. But she hadn't. Because Perkins was on the gate that morning with no particular instructions, and Lord Aldridge had arrived a few minutes early, and Miriam had happened to be at the troublesome loom she had been meaning to look at herself, and there he was, and there she was, and he had looked at her and seen a mill worker and pressed his card into her hand and asked her to fetch her employer. And she had thought, well, then, my lord, let us see who you actually are before you put your best face on. Now you must understand the man who made that mistake, my dear friends, because he is not who you might assume. He is not a schemer, he is not a fool, or not more so than circumstances had made him. He is a decent man at a crossroads where all the roads look much the same from a distance, and you only learn which was wrong after you've gone a mile down it. Julian Aldridge had inherited his title 2 years before, when his older brother died of a fever. He had been the second son his entire life, expected to find a profession, make his own way, not trouble the estate. He had been content with that arrangement. He had been reading law, and then there were letters, and a funeral, and a solicitor, who sat him down with a particular expression, and explained the state of Aldridge Park in terms that left no comfortable place for the mind to rest. The estate was not ruined. It was, as the solicitor put it with admirable delicacy, comprehensively burdened. His brother had been a man of appetites and insufficient attention to consequence. The tenant farms needed drainage work. Without it, 2 more bad harvests and 3 families would be gone. The roof of the east wing had been the subject of optimism for a decade, which is to say it leaked reliably every November. There were debts not of the dramatic kind. No creditors at the gate, but of the slow, grinding sort that eat through capital the way rust eats through iron, and can do so for years before anyone notices the damage. Julian had spent a year doing the arithmetic in every direction. He had sold what could be sold with dignity. He had cut what could be cut without causing harm. He had arrived at the conclusion that second sons of encumbered estates have reached, since estates began, he needed income. Not a quick sum, but a steady one. Long-term contracts, good tenants, land brought back to proper yield, which was why he was sitting in the back office of a Yorkshire mill, turning his hat in his hands, trying to remember when he had last slept past 5. His solicitor had said, the morning he left for the north, that the late Mr. Trent's widow had been alone with the business for 3 years, and that widows in such a position were often, by that point, ready for a simpler arrangement. That a little patience, a little charm, might produce terms rather more generous than what the contract strictly warranted. Julian had said nothing to this. He had looked out the carriage window for a long moment, and then said, very quietly, that he would be presenting his offer on its merits, and conducting himself accordingly. His solicitor had smiled the smile of a man who believes he is indulging a scruple that won't survive the journey. Julian had spent most of the road north quietly furious about it. That is the man who pressed his card into Miriam Trent's hand and asked her to deliver it to her employer. Not a villain, a man in an uncomfortable position, given advice he found dishonorable, still deciding, mile by mile, how firmly to refuse it. She came to the office herself, still in the leather apron, because she saw no reason to perform a change of clothes for a man who had already shown her plainly how Hoffy saw the world, and she offered him tea, and he accepted, and she sat across her own desk from him and waited. He talked. Not immediately. At first he was correct, contained all the forms of a man in a formal meeting. He went through the outline of his requirements, the wool cloth for the tenant houses, the order quantities, the delivery terms. She listened and said little, because she already knew the numbers, and because she was watching him. Something loosened, though. She could not have said exactly when. Perhaps when she asked him about the drainage work on his tenant farms, and he answered it properly. Not a performance of knowledge, but the real thing, the kind that comes from having stood in muddy fields and looked at the problem yourself. Perhaps it was when she corrected a figure in his supply estimate, and he did not blink or defer, or look past her for someone to confirm it. He looked at the correction, thought a moment, and said she was right. Or perhaps it was simply that he had been alone with his difficulties for a long time, and she had a way of listening that made a man forget himself. "My solicitor," he said on the second morning. They had been talking an hour ostensibly about delivery schedules, actually about rather more. Told me that the late Mr. Trent's widow was likely to be, and I am paraphrasing very generously, amenable to a sympathetic approach. He turned his teacup. "I want you to know, because you've been honest with me and it seems only fair, that I found that advice repellent, and I intend to ignore it entirely. I'm here because your mill has a good reputation and my offer is a fair one. If Mrs. Trent disagrees, I will accept her decision and not attempt to charm my way around it." Miriam said very carefully, "And if she agrees?" "Then I'd like to think she agreed because the offer was worth agreeing to." He paused, not because someone walked in here and told her a sad story about tenant farmers. The mill was quiet around them. In the late morning, the loom's 2 rooms away, a low and steady pulse. Miriam had Lord Aldridge's business card in the pocket of her apron, where she had put it in the weaving room and had not taken it out since. "You've been very frank," she said, "for a man who came to negotiate." I find I can't do it any other way." He looked at her then, the way a man looks at when he has said more than he intended and is deciding whether to pull it back. He didn't pull it back. "I gave up a great deal when I took on this estate. I sold things I was sorry to sell, which is only money, and I rearranged plans I had made for myself, which is ordinary enough. What I haven't been willing to sell is this." He touched his collar, a small, unconscious gesture. "Whatever you might call it, the right to look at myself honestly at the end of a day. I'll find another road before I sit across from a woman who has been running a business alone for 3 years and use her circumstances as a lever." Miriam sat very still. He pushed back slightly from the desk. "Forgive me, I don't know why I keep saying things in this office I hadn't planned to say. You are a very good listener. Better than I deserve, given that I'm not paying you anything for your time." "No," said Miriam, "you're not." "Which makes you either very generous," he said, "or very curious." She thought both if she was being honest. What she did not say, what she had been not saying for 2 days with increasing difficulty, was that she had stopped watching him like a subject of study some time during the first month. She had begun listening the way you listen to someone you might like to know for a long while. He had a quality, rare in the men who came through this office, of asking questions and then waiting for the answers. He disagreed with her about the second quarter's pricing structure and said so plainly and gave his reasons, and when she gave him the reason he was wrong, he accepted it without theatre. He was, and she was aware this was a dangerous thing to think, a fair-minded man. Not performing fairness, practicing it the way you practice something long enough that it stops being effort and becomes simply how you are. She was also aware that she had deceived him for 2 days, and that this was a debt that would need settling. He stood to leave. On the second afternoon, the contract terms agreed, and waiting for his solicitor to review the following morning. He stood at the office door and turned back. "I don't suppose," he said, "you'd be willing to tell me your name, properly. I've been talking to you for 2 days, and I only know you from the floor." Miriam stood, reached into the pocket of her apron, placed his card on the desk between them, face up. Lord Aldridge looked at the card. He looked at her. He looked at the desk. At the papers, stacked in neat order, the accounts ledger open to this week's entries, the correspondence addressed uniformly to M. Trent, proprietress, Havelock Mill. At the leather apron, the rolled-up sleeves, the wrist with the stripe of machine oil, she had not quite managed to scrub off. At the hand he had pressed his card into, 2 days ago in the weaving room. "I am Mrs. Trent," said Miriam. "I own the mill." The silence in that office was very full. He did not speak for a long moment. She watched the understanding move across him. The card, the weaving room, 2 days of conversation, every careful thing he had said while she sat across from him, knowing what he did not. She watched the color change in his face. Not quite anger, something more tender than anger and more painful. The expression of a man who believed he had been, for 2 days, entirely honest, and has just discovered that the room he thought was private had a window in it all along. 2 days, he said at last. Yes. From the card. Yes. He was quiet. She did not rush him. She thought he deserved that much. Was it useful, he asked finally, for the contract? The contract, said Miriam, was decided the first morning. When you told me about your solicitor's advice and said you found it repellent, she kept her voice steady. Everything after that was, she stopped. Started again. I kept listening because I wanted to. Not for any business reason. He reached out and picked his card up from the desk. Turned it over once, put it in his breast pocket. You sat there, he said, and let me tell you I intended to treat Mrs. Trent fairly, while you were Mrs. Trent. Yes. And that using a woman's isolation as a negotiating lever was something I would not do, to the woman in question. Yes. A long pause. Outside, the looms resumed their rhythm, a low, steady heartbeat through the walls. 3 years, he said quietly. Men arriving and looking past you. Yes. And I came through the gate and handed you your own message to carry. He looked at the desk, at the ledger, at the apron. Of course you wanted to see what I was actually made of. It was still wrong of me, Miriam said. I know that. Yes, he said. It was. He thought for a moment longer. But the arithmetic is strange, isn't it? You watched me for 2 days with no reason on earth to guard myself, and I said everything I would have said if there had been no proprietress and no contract and no consequence of any kind. I had not the faintest idea who you were. He looked up. Which means you know my actual character rather better than anyone in my acquaintance, including my own solicitor. I can't walk any of it back. I wouldn't know where to start. I wouldn't ask you to, Miriam said. He studied her a long moment, the honest man's arithmetic working behind his eyes. I'm going to be angry about this tomorrow, he said. I want you to know that in advance. It will probably last most of the morning, and then I am going to remember that I rode 3 days north, prepared to despise myself indefinitely, and you have somehow arranged it so that I don't have to. That will be very difficult to stay angry about. Miriam felt the thing she had been holding carefully for 2 days go loose all at once. The contract stands, she said, if you still want it. I do. He moved toward the door, stopped. He did that, she had noticed, left room slowly, as though he kept finding one more thing worth saying. For what it is worth, and I am aware the context makes it worth rather less, I meant what I said this morning, about what I am willing to sell and what I am not. I know, said Miriam Trent, that is why you got the contract. He almost smiled. The almost was, she thought, better than the smile itself might have been. They signed the papers the following morning. He wrote once in November and twice in December, and the letters were strictly professional and went on rather longer than strictly professional letters have any business doing. He came back in January, ostensibly to discuss the terms of the spring delivery. He stayed 4 days. On the last day, he asked her, standing in the weaving room where it had all begun, whether she might be willing to receive a personal call at some future time, of a nature entirely separate from the supply agreement. She said yes, on one condition. You still have the card, said Lord Aldridge. I kept it, said Miriam Trent. You pressed it into my hand with all the authority of a man certain he knew exactly who he was talking to. And now you know precisely who you are talking to. She looked at him steadily. Don't make the same mistake twice. He didn't. They were married before the following winter. To the general surprise of the county, which had long concluded that a widow who ran a mill herself and corresponded with a viscount about wool pricing was far too sensible a woman to do anything as impractical as fall in love. Counties are frequently wrong about women who know their own minds. Havelock Mill continued on. Aldridge Park got its drainage done and its east wing roof, and the kind of slow, steady prosperity that comes from a business managed well and an estate managed honestly. Julian walked the mill floor with Miriam most mornings when he was in Yorkshire, and he learned to read the looms, though never quite as quickly as she could. The tenant farmers of Aldridge Park got their good wool cloth and their renegotiated leases, and most of them simply noticed that things had improved without being entirely certain how. The leather apron was never retired. Lady Aldridge, which was what she was now, though she remained Mrs. Trent of Havelock Mill in the same breath, wore it on the floor until the day she trained her foreman's apprentice to take over the morning walk, and then she wore it a few times a week, and then whenever she felt like it, which was frequently. The men who came to the mill in the years after, the suppliers, the buyers, the occasional gentleman who had heard that Havelock cloth was worth the journey north, were forever looking past the woman in the leather apron for the person in charge, and they were forever being handed a business card by the proprietress herself, with a particular look in her eye that her husband recognized from across a room and loved unreservedly every single time. The first card, the one Lord Aldridge had pressed into her hand on a Wednesday morning in October, as though she were anyone at all, was framed on the wall of the mill office, not beside any commendation or contract or portrait of the building in better days, just by itself, on the wall behind the desk, in a plain frame. Because it was the beginning of the only genuinely honest negotiation Miriam Trent had ever sat across the table from, and the only one that ended with something better than a contract. You have sat with me tonight, through a case of mistaken identity, 2 days of careful honesty, and 2 people who found their way to certainty by the most roundabout road imaginable. If it has given you something, a quiet warmth, a small smile, a thought that the truth, even when it arrives at an awkward angle, is nearly always worth the having, then I hope you will stay. Subscribe to Moonlight at Bellwood, my dear friends, if you have not yet. Come back to the fire. There are always more stories, and they are always worth the sitting. And if you will not, well, you know what I am going to say. You owe me one. You have owed me since a business card changed hands in a Yorkshire weaving room, and I am patient, and I remember every single debt. Come back next time, beneath the soft light of an autumn evening, where every love is earned, and every honest mistake is, eventually, the best thing a person ever made. Good night. And do be careful, won't you, about handing your card to strangers. You can never quite be certain whose hand you are pressing it into.